People always say that the hardest goodbyes are the ones you never get to say. But I've learned something different. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't saying goodbye. It's finally understanding that the people who were supposed to love you the most were never really there to begin with. My name is Dorothy. I'm 67 years old and I live alone in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. I have a vegetable garden in the backyard, a cat named Biscuit who sleeps on my feet every night, and more time than I know what to do with. Most mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee and watch the light come up over the ridge, and I think, this is enough. This right here is enough. But it wasn't always like that. There are moments in your life that split everything into before and after. The day I walked into my own living room and found my son Nathan and my daughter-in-law sitting across from each other at my kitchen table. Not talking, just waiting. That was one of those moments. I didn't know it yet. I still had my coat on. I was still holding grocery bags from Kroger. I bought peaches because they were on sale and I was thinking about making a cobbler. I never made that cobbler. Let me back up a little because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I grew up in Chattanooga. My parents weren't wealthy, but they worked hard and they raised me and my youngest sister, Agnes, with the understanding that family means something. You show up. You stay. You don't leave people behind. Those weren't words in our house. They were just the way things were done. Agnes and I were close the way sisters can be when there's only two of you and the world feels big. She was 3 years younger than me, quieter, more careful with her feelings. I was always the one talking too much, moving too fast, getting into things. She was the one who thought before she spoke. We balanced each other out. We both married young, me to a man named Richard, her to a man named Thomas. Richard and I had 2 children, Nathan, and then 4 years later, my daughter Lynette. Life moved fast the way it does when you're raising kids on a school teacher's salary and your husband works in insurance. We weren't struggling, but we weren't comfortable either. Every month felt like math. Agnes and Thomas never had children. It took me a long time to understand what that absence cost her, because she never talked about it directly. She'd mention it sometimes sideways, a comment about a neighbor's baby, a quiet moment at someone else's Christmas dinner, and then she'd change the subject and pour more sweet tea and ask you about your tomato plants. That was Agnes. She carried things privately. Thomas passed away in 2009. Heart attack. Unexpected. 62 years old. Agnes was 58 and suddenly alone in the house they'd shared in Maryville for 30 years. I drove over the same afternoon I heard. I didn't call first. I just got in the car. That's what you do. After Thomas died, Agnes and I got even closer. We talked every few days. I drove over when I could. She started spending more time in Knoxville, holidays, long weekends. When Richard passed in 2014, she was the first person at my door. And she stayed for 2 weeks. She cooked. She sat with me while I cried. She didn't try to fix anything. She just stayed. I don't know how to explain to you what it means to have someone who just stays. By the time my kids were in their 40s, they had their own lives, which is how it should be, I know that. Nathan was in Charlotte with his wife Brenda and their 3 kids. Lynette was out in Phoenix, remarried, busy. We talked on holidays and birthdays. They called when they remembered and didn't, when they didn't. I told myself that was normal. I told myself I wasn't lonely. The trouble started, honestly, the year Nathan's business started having problems. He'd been running a landscaping company for about 12 years. Good years at first, then harder ones. He'd taken out loans I didn't know about. He and Brenda had extended themselves on a house that was probably too much. I found out pieces of this slowly, the way you find out things your children don't want to tell you. A comment here, a number that didn't add up there. Then came the visit. It was a Sunday in March. Nathan drove up alone, without Brenda, which should have told me something. He sat at my kitchen table and he looked tired and he said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the house." He didn't mean his house, he meant mine. The house I'd lived in for 31 years. The house Richard and I bought when Nathan was 7. The house where we put up Christmas lights every December and grown tomatoes every summer and painted the kitchen 4 different colors, trying to get it right. He wanted me to take out a home equity line of credit and give him access to the funds to stabilize the business. He said it was temporary. He said he had a plan. He said he just needed a bridge, Mom, just something to get through the next 6 months. I said I needed to think about it. I called Agnes that evening. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was her way. Then she said, "Dorothy, I love Nathan, but I want you to be careful. I want you to talk to someone before you sign anything." I did talk to someone. A financial advisor I'd used for years, a woman named Patricia at a firm downtown. She went over my situation and she was kind about it, but direct. She said that at my age, with my income, putting my home at risk was not something she could recommend. She said there were other options Nathan should be exploring first. I went back to Nathan and I told him what Patricia said. I told him I loved him and I wanted to help him, but not this way. Not with the house. That was when things changed. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, the way winter comes. You don't notice it until one day you realize you haven't been warm in a long time. Nathan stopped calling as much. When we did talk, there was a coolness to it. Brenda stopped including me in family group texts. My grandchildren, 3 of them, kids I'd babysat and baked cookies with and driven to soccer practice, went quiet. One birthday passed where only Lynette called. I told myself it would pass. I told myself he was stressed and embarrassed and it would work itself out. Then Brenda called me. She was polite, the way someone is polite when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. She told me that Nathan was really struggling, that the family was under tremendous pressure, and that she actually used the word feel, that my refusal to help had contributed to a real crisis in their lives. She said she hoped I understood the weight of that. I sat very still while she talked. I had the phone pressed to my ear so hard it left a mark. When she finished, I said, "Brenda, I'm sorry you're going through a hard time. I'm sorry Nathan is struggling. I want to help in ways that don't put my security at risk," I said. "I am his mother, not his bank." She didn't say much after that. We hung up. 3 weeks later, Nathan sent me a letter. An actual letter, typed and mailed, which struck me as a very strange way to communicate, until I realized it was because he wanted a record. The letter said that he felt our relationship had become too painful to maintain at this time, and that he needed space to focus on his family's needs. He said he hoped I would reflect on my choices. I read that letter sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and put it in a drawer. I didn't hear from him again for 4 years. Lynette called when she found out, and to her credit, she was angry at Nathan. We talked for a long time, but Lynette had her own life in Phoenix, her own complications. She didn't have the bandwidth to bridge what had broken, and I didn't ask her to. I told her I was fine. I was getting better at saying that. Those years were hard in ways I didn't expect. Not dramatically hard. There was no single terrible thing. It was the accumulation of small absences. No Christmas with my grandchildren. No one to call on a Tuesday just to talk. Eating dinner alone every night and having the television on, not because I wanted to watch anything, but because silence can start to feel like an indictment. Agnes kept me going. She really did. She started coming to Knoxville more. Sometimes she'd stay a week and we'd fall into a routine. Coffee in the morning, errands, cooking dinner together, talking long into the evening about everything and nothing. She taught me how to make her mother-in-law's chicken and dumplings recipe. I showed her how to use the raised garden beds I'd built in the backyard. We went to a bluegrass festival in Townsend and laughed until we cried at a man who played the spoons. She was my person. That's the only way I can put it. When everything else felt diminished, Agnes was constant. I want you to understand something about Agnes that matters to this story. She was not a wealthy woman in the way people usually mean. She had the house in Maryville, which was paid off. She had Thomas's pension. She had savings, carefully accumulated over decades, because Agnes never spent money on anything she didn't need, and she was quietly, consistently smart about investing. She lived simply. She drove the same Buick for 11 years. She clipped coupons not because she had to, but because she thought waste was disrespectful. She never talked about what she had. That wasn't her way. In the fall of 2021, Agnes was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I found out on a Thursday afternoon when she called and said, "Dorothy, I need to tell you something, and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and looked out the window at my garden and listened. She was very calm. She had already talked to her doctor, she said. She understood what the prognosis was. She had things she needed to put in order, and she wanted me to know first. I let her finish. Then I sat down on the floor right there in the kitchen because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. I drove to Maryville the next morning, and I didn't leave for 3 weeks. The months that followed were the most painful and the most precious of my life. I moved in with Agnes for the last 4 months. I learned how to manage medications and talk to hospice workers and sit with someone in the middle of the night when they're frightened. Not trying to take the fear away, but just making sure they're not alone in it. I learned that love sometimes looks like changing sheets and making broth and reading out loud from whatever book the other person wants to hear. We talked about everything in those months, things we'd never said, things we'd thought for decades but set aside because life kept moving. She told me about the years after Thomas died and how she'd found her own way to a kind of peace that she hadn't expected. I told her about Nathan, the parts I'd kept back because I didn't want to burden her. She listened, and she said, "Dorothy, you did the right thing." And then she took my hand. She passed on a quiet April morning. I was in the room. I drove home to Knoxville in the rain. I went inside and sat in the dark for a long time. Her attorney called me 2 weeks later and asked me to come in. I want to be honest about this moment. I had no idea what was coming. Agnes and I had never discussed her estate, not directly. She'd mentioned once, years before, that she'd redone her will after Thomas died, but we hadn't talked about the details and I hadn't asked. It didn't feel like my business. I went to that meeting expecting to hear about some keepsakes she'd wanted me to have, her mother's china maybe, or the quilt from Thomas's family that she'd always loved. Her attorney, a quiet man named Dennis who'd clearly done this many times before, handed me a document and waited while I read it. Agnes had left me everything: the house in Maryville, the investment accounts, the savings, a life insurance policy. When Dennis told me the total value, I had to ask him to repeat it because the number didn't register the first time. It was just under $900,000. I drove home in a kind of fog. I sat in my living room with biscuit in my lap, and I cried for a long time, not about the money, but about Agnes, about the fact that she'd done this, that even at the end, when she was dealing with her own fear and her own loss, she'd been thinking about me, about whether I would be all right. I did not call Nathan. I did not call Annette. I called Patricia, my financial advisor, and I called Dennis back the next day with some questions. I was careful. Agnes would have wanted me to be careful. 6 weeks after Agnes's will was settled, Nathan called. He said he'd heard about Aunt Agnes passing and he was so sorry. He'd always loved her. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking lately and he felt terrible about the distance between us. He said he missed me. He said the kids missed me. He was warm. He was everything I'd wanted him to be for 4 years. I sat very still on my porch while he talked, and I watched a cardinal land on the bird bath, and I thought, why now? Why after 4 years of silence? Why now? Why after 4 years of silence? Why now? I knew the answer. Of course I did. Someone had told him something. Small towns talk, and Maryville to Knoxville is 40 minutes, and Agnes had known people who knew people. But I didn't say that. I told him it was good to hear from him. I told him I appreciated the call. When he asked if he could come visit sometime, I said, Let me think on it, Nathan. He started calling every week after that. Then Brenda called, warmer now, friendlier, asking about my health, mentioning the grandchildren. My grandson Tyler sent me a birthday card for the first time in 4 years, handwritten, which Brenda had clearly prompted, but which I still read 3 times. 2 months after that first call, Nathan and Brenda both drove up to Knoxville on a Saturday morning. They brought a coffee cake from a bakery in Charlotte. Nathan hugged me in the doorway, and he held on for a long time. We sat in my living room and we talked for 2 hours. They were careful. They were kind. They asked about Agnes, about how I was doing, about the garden, and then Nathan said, "Mom, I want you to know that we want to be a family again." He said, "Brenda and I have talked a lot, and we know we hurt you, and we want to make things right." I listened to all of it. I offered them more coffee. I showed Brenda the news section of garden I'd put in. When they left, Nathan hugged me again and said he'd call soon. He did call the following Thursday, and on that call, gentle as rain, he mentioned that he'd heard Agnes had been quite well off, and wasn't it wonderful that she'd thought of me? And what did I think I'd do with the house in Maryville? Was I planning to sell it, and had I figured out how I wanted to manage everything? There it was. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Nathan, I have a good team helping me with all of that." He said that was smart, and then he said, "And I will remember this for the rest of my life. That, of course, family should be part of those conversations too whenever I was ready, because they cared about my future." After I hung up, I called Dennis. I told Dennis everything. He listened. Then he said, "Dorothy, you're not obligated to do anything. Your sister's estate passed to you cleanly and legally. You can do exactly as you wish." I said, "I know that. I just wanted to hear it out loud." A month later, Nathan and Brenda, along with Lynette, who had flown in from Phoenix, arrived at my house together on a Saturday morning, unannounced. I watched from the window when their cars pulled up. I had been expecting something like this. I let them in. I made coffee. I sat across from all 3 of them at my kitchen table. Nathan did most of the talking. He was measured, careful with his words. He said that as my children, they were concerned about my ability to manage such a significant estate on my own. He said they wanted to be involved in my financial planning to protect me. He used the word protect 3 times. Then Brenda mentioned gently that they had spoken to someone, an attorney, she was careful to say, just for some general information, who had said that in cases like this, family members sometimes petitioned for certain financial oversight arrangements. My daughter, Lynette, was quiet the whole time. She wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I let them finish. Then I said, "I'm glad you're here." And I reached over and opened the drawer in the side table next to my chair. A drawer I had put things in very deliberately the day before, and I took out a business card and slid it across the table. I said, "This is Dennis Archer. He's the attorney handling Agnes's estate. He's been working with me on everything. He knows you might be calling." I also said I've updated my own will. I said it pleasantly, just as a piece of information. Nathan looked at the card. Then he looked at me. Something shifted in his face that I hadn't seen in 4 years. Something that looked like his actual feelings, not the performance of feelings. For just a moment, the coffee cake and the warm calls and the Saturday visit fell away, and he was just my son, looking at his mother, and I could see that he was ashamed. I didn't press it. I didn't say everything I could have said, because despite everything, he is still my son, and I am still his mother. And there's a part of me that grieves that, the part that still hears him at 7 years old asking me to check under the bed for monsters. But I did not offer him access to Agnes's estate. I did not offer Brenda reassurance. I did not give Lynette an opening. They left about an hour later. Nathan hugged me at the door and said, "Mum, I hope we can find our way back from this." I said, "I hope so too, Nathan," and I meant it. I really did. But hope is not a plan, and wanting something and deserving it are 2 very different things. He knew that. I think somewhere under all of it, he knew. After they left, I went out to the backyard and worked in the garden for a couple of hours. I pulled weeds and staked the tomatoes and turned the compost. Biscuit sat on the porch step and watched me with that superior cat expression that means nothing and somehow still helps. I thought about Agnes. I thought about that April morning and her hand in mine, and the rain on the windows. I thought about all the years she'd been careful and quiet and consistent, living within her means, not making a fuss, just doing the right thing over and over. And how that quiet care had somehow wrapped around me even after she was gone. She'd always said that you can't choose your family, but you can choose who you let into your life. She said it like it was simple. I used to think she was being hard. Now I understand she was being honest. I am not angry at my children. I want to say that clearly because anger would be simpler, and it's not quite right. What I feel is something more like sadness with a flaw under it, a grief that doesn't bottomless drop the way it used to, because I finally know what solid ground feels like. I found it in a garden in Knoxville and in 11 years of phone calls with a woman who drove a Buick too long and clipped coupons and showed up at my door the day Richard died. I use Agnes's money carefully. I take care of the house in Maryville. I've been renting it to a young family, a school teacher and her husband, and I don't charge them as much as I could because Agnes would have liked that. I've made a donation to the hospice organization that cared for her in those last weeks. I've set up a small scholarship at the high school in Chattanooga, where we grew up, for girls who want to go into nursing, because that was what Agnes had wanted to do when she was 17 before life went a different direction. I've also updated my will, as I mentioned. Dennis helped me with that. It is very detailed, very clear, and does not contain surprises. Nathan sends a card every Christmas now. He calls on my birthday and on Mother's Day. I answer. We talk for a while. It is polite and careful, and sometimes, briefly, it is something warmer than that. I am not sure where it ends up. I am not ready to let him back all the way in. Not yet, maybe not ever, I don't know. What I do know is that I am not waiting anymore. I am not watching the phone. I am not measuring my value by who calls. I sat on my porch this morning with my coffee and biscuit, and I watched the light come up over the ridge, the way I do. And I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who kept the grocery bags in her hands because she didn't understand what was happening yet. The one who read a terrible letter twice and put it in a drawer and didn't cry until she was alone. That woman survived. She did more than survive. She found her way to something Agnes always had, and I had to learn the hard way, that quiet, steady sense of being enough on your own. The cobbler I never made that day. I made it last summer. Peaches from the farmer's market on Broadway, a recipe I finally figured out after 4 or 5 attempts. It was good. I ate it on the porch and shared some with my neighbor Patricia, who is 81 and has a better garden than I do and doesn't let me forget it. I don't need much, but what I have is mine, and I know how to keep it. I think Agnes knew I'd figure that out eventually. I think that's why she trusted me with everything she'd saved. I am trying every day to be worthy of that trust. I've thought a lot about what made Nathan come back, and I think the honest answer is that it wasn't me. It was never really me. It was the idea of what I might now represent, a number, a house, a shifted equation. That's a hard thing to sit with when you're talking about your own child. But sitting with hard things honestly is, I've come to believe, one of the only ways to actually get through them. What I kept coming back to was Agnes. Not the money she left me, the way she lived before any of that. She made a choice every single day to be careful and decent and present. She showed up when Thomas died, and she showed up when Richard died, and she drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday just because she thought I sounded tired on the phone. Nobody asked her to do any of that. There was no reward system. She just believed that how you treat people is who you are, and she acted accordingly for decades without making a fuss about it. That kind of consistency builds something. I don't think Agnes set out to teach me anything. She wasn't that kind of person. She would have found that embarrassing. But watching her over 40 years taught me more about character than anything else in my life. It taught me that integrity isn't a grand gesture. It's what you do on an ordinary Wednesday when no one is watching and there's nothing to gain. Nathan had choices too. He had 4 years of Wednesdays. He could have called in any one of them, not because I had money, not because there was something to get, just because I was his mother. And he loved me once. And love, real love, requires tending. He didn't make those calls. That was his choice, and choices compound. They don't stay still. Every week of silence became part of who he decided to be in relation to me. And by the time he showed up with that coffee cake, something between us had calcified in a way that warmth alone couldn't soften. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because I think it's important to be clear-eyed about how things actually work. We tell ourselves that people can change overnight, that love can reset everything with one sincere conversation. Sometimes maybe it can, but most of the time, trust is rebuilt the way it was broken, slowly, in small increments, over a long stretch of time. Nathan has a long way to go. I don't know if he has the patience for it. I don't know if I have the space. What I do know is that I am not the woman who stood in her kitchen holding peaches and didn't understand what was happening. I am not the woman who read a letter twice and put it away and waited to cry until she was alone. I earned my way out of that, not through anything dramatic, just through paying attention, through leaning on the right people, through refusing to let grief become permanent residence. Agnes left me her savings. But what she really left me was proof that a quiet life lived with honesty and care adds up to something real, something that holds. I am trying to spend that inheritance wisely. The money, yes, but more than that, the example. The daily practice of it, the choice, every ordinary Wednesday, to be someone worth trusting. That is enough, more than enough, and I finally fully believe it.